Right, thanks everyone for coming. My name is David Cox, and I'm a co-organizer of this symposium together with Pavlos Protopappas and Kathy Chute and the amazing team at iacs. We have an incredible lineup of scientists across the divide of neuroscience and computer science today. But before I start, I do have one bit of bad news. Because of the impending Snowmageddon in Washington, D.C., one of our speakers, actually the first speaker, is unfortunate, Jacob Vogelstein from IARPA, is unfortunately not going to be able to attend because he basically didn't want to get trapped, and he absolutely would have gotten trapped. It's very strange that the weather is colder there than it is here, but such are these times. So for the next little while, I'm going to do some tap dancing and tell some jokes to fill that time. Off we go. So if you'll indulge me for a bit, I just want to take a step back, really big picture, and think about what's exciting about neuroscience and computer science today. And really what drives us in our interest here at this intersection is that these are two of the fastest moving fields in the world today, and they're on a collision course increasingly with each other. But if we take a step back, why do we care about neuroscience, particularly in the context of computer science? Science itself is about understanding our world. And if we're honest with ourselves, there's a significant component of understanding where we fit in the world and understanding why we're special in the world. And this is a really interesting question. Why are we special? How are we different from the rest of nature? And it's tempting to think that we're some sort of culmination of evolution. But actually, if you study biology, you'll learn that's not true. There's a dizzying array of species on Earth, and all of them are exquisitely adapted to the niche that they occupy. There's nothing special about us, it's just we occupy a different niche. But nonetheless, we have the sense that there's something special about us. But we're not the most numerous species. We're not the largest species. We're not the strongest or the fastest. We're not the longest lived. We're not the most resilient. We're not many of these things. So what is it, if anything, that makes us unique in the world? And I would argue that it's our complexity. And not complexity in some generic sense, because nature is rife with complexity. What's special about humans is the complexity of our brains. And it's that complexity that's allowed us to conquer the Earth, to transmit information across generations, to teach each other, to learn, to work together, to pass on culture, to occupy basically every surface, every place on the globe, and to extend even beyond it. And every work of art, every edifice of civilization, all music, are all products of the complexity of our brains. At the same time, this complexity, we're slaves to it. So if we stray but a little from the sort of perfect plan, we are beset by mental disorders and disease. And just as everything good that humanity has done comes from our complexity, so too do all of the negative aspects in the world. So when we say we want to study the brain, at a deep level, what we mean is that we want to study ourselves and study what's unique and special about ourselves. Now, because we focus inward in our outlook on the outside world, we have this curious tendency to describe ourselves and to reason about ourselves in terms of our own technology of the day. So in the era of Descartes, in the 17th century, hydraulic technologies were the technology of the day. So Descartes talked about movement of bodies as animating fluids moving through the body to cause motion and to interact and move with the environment. In the era of Sigmund Freud, steam was the technology of the day. So we started talking about pressure being released and built up and engines of the conscious and the subconscious. Move forward to the electronics era, and suddenly radio metaphors start creeping into our discussion of the brain. We talk about being on the same channel or being on the same wavelength or having crossed wires. Now fast forward to the present day, and computers are undoubtedly the technology of the day. It has changed the way we live. We walk around with supercomputers in our pockets that we look at all the time. And you might be tempted to think that these computers are just another metaphor. And in some ways, they are a metaphor the same way that those other technologies were just metaphors. And these metaphors can lead you astray. But the difference is that in this case, computer science provides formal tools that make this more than a metaphor. Not only do we can we think about and analogize between brains and computers, but we can actually understand a separation between algorithms, what we're computing, and implementations, the hardware that we use. And this powerful ability to reason about the brain as a computer makes this era very different than those that came before. So why is this important? So if we look at our pharmaceuticals, our medical establishment, many people, when we say neuroscience, the first thing you might think would be, the first thing that might come to mind is mental disorders or disease. But today we're increasingly reaching an era where medical science is knocking down the major sort of diseases that harm humans one by one, but the last sort of intransigent core that's been hardest to reach have been so-called chronic non-communicable disorders, and particularly mental disorders, things like schizophrenia and depression. And the thing that's interesting about these disorders is that there's no anatomical or genetic smoking gun for these things. Something's wrong with the brain, but it's not so much that something wrong with some particular structure that we can point to, but rather something wrong with the software of the brain or something wrong with the wiring of the brain. So this is a picture of Prozac, and this gives you a sense of, Prozac is actually a great example of what's wrong with our therapeutics today. Basically, serotonin targets a particular receptor, a reuptake mechanism in the brain for serotonin, but it's a very blunt tool. It affects every serotonin everywhere in the brain and elsewhere in the body. There's lots of serotonin in your gut and your heart, and Prozac affects all of these things. So in many ways, our current approaches to dealing with mental disease are very, very blunt tools that result from us not fully understanding the actual inner workings of the computer that we have in our heads. Increasingly also, to the extent that we can understand the software of the brain, and we can understand the language by which the brain communicates within and without itself, we can start to interface with the brain. So on the left is an example of a widely dispersed technology that's been mature for many years, the cochlear implant. Basically, it's a bionic ear. So the way this works is you implant an electrode into the cochlea, which is the organ in your ear that actually transduces sound. And now what we can do is we can take we can take electrical impulses from the outside and we can restore function where hearing might be lost. On the right, we have a more ambitious, more recent development. It's a technology called BrainGate. So the idea here is that if you have a locked-in patient, a quadriplegic patient, you can put electrodes directly into their brain and then be able to communicate with the brain such that you can, the patient who's locked in can nonetheless, say, control a robot arm. Now these are very, very early stage technologies, but you can get a sense that as we understand more and more about computing and understand more and more about how that relates to the brain, we can start to make these incredible advances. But it actually goes quite a bit farther than that. And what I'd like to convince you of, and what many of the panelists and speakers today will be able to address, is a sense that actually neuroscience and computational neuroscience and the intersection of computing and neuroscience goes to every corner of our life. So as we understand how the brain works, we start to begin to be able to contemplate building systems that work the same way. So here we have an assortment of different jobs that people do in the world. So we have somebody on the top left who's sweeping. We have some people building cars in a factory. We have people looking at poultry, all sorts of jobs that people do today. But increasingly, machines are taking over these jobs. So on the left, we have the iRobot Roomba, which is a very simple replacement for somebody who might sweep the floor. It doesn't have a very complicated brain in it, perhaps a brain more like an insect brain, but it's sort of the early advance guard of this revolution that's happening in robotics, where increasingly robots are able to replace people. On the right, we have a car factory where industrial robots for many, many years have been assisting in building and assembling cars. But beyond that advance guard, we have a new generation of robotics that's arriving now. So on the left, we have Asimo, which is a robot, bipedal robot made by Honda. It doesn't exactly have a purpose other than to showcase the technology that Honda has, but it's an impressive piece of technology. And on the right, we have Baxter, a robot designed by a startup coming out of MIT that not only can perform pre-programmed tasks, but can actually work with people on a factory line to understand and learn how to do new tasks. And it has rudimentary vision, it has rudimentary arms, and these are sort of the first forays into greatly expanding the range of activities that machines can do. And of course, very much in the zeitgeist today, increasingly tasks like driving cars are being taken over by computers. So these are the Google cars. So they use a combination of cameras for vision and a laser scanner, which is that sort of cylinder-shaped thing on the top. And increasingly, we're hearing many different companies pouring money into this idea that humans really shouldn't be driving cars, and maybe computers would be even better at driving cars than we are ourselves. And of course, this has led to a tectonic shift in artificial intelligence funding and the landscape of the field in the last couple years. So these are all headlines taken from the last couple years. Google acquires artificial intelligence startup DeepMind for about $500 million. Yahoo, Twitter, Baidu, they're basically buying up large swaths of the academic field of artificial intelligence. There are some estimates coming from people at Google saying that something like 10% of the field of machine learning and artificial intelligence now works for one of these companies. It's a privatization of an academic field on a scale that's unprecedented. So there's a lot of smart money on this idea that as we understand brains and we can build systems that work the same way, we might be able to do new things that we couldn't do before. And largely, this is driven by advances in compute. And this is the second wave that's been kind of driving across this ability to have huge amounts of compute, huge amounts of data, huge amounts of storage to drive all these technologies forward. Now, not everyone agrees that this is a good thing. This is Elon Musk. He compares building artificial intelligence to summoning the demon. A little bit flowery in terms of language. Here's another version of that. Stephen Hawking warns artificial intelligence could end mankind. Clearly some smart people think that the stakes here are very high and that there's a possibility that this can go in a negative direction. But one thing that's clear is everybody, at least the zeitgeist of the world today, suggests that really big shifts in how the world works going forward are close at hand. Now, if we were to take a slightly more conservative approach, I could show you this video. This is the DARPA Grand Challenge for Robotics in 2015. Oh no, okay. So the Robo Apocalypse isn't quite upon us yet. These are amazing robots, it should be said. They're funny to watch, but just the sheer technical ability that has gone into these is incredible. But there's clearly more that we need to be able to do. I'm going to turn that off because that's a little bit distracting. There are other places where, in spite of the fact that we have computers and we have systems that can understand, say, images, they still aren't good enough to do all the things we'd like them to do. So this is an example literally close to home. In the Boston Marathon bombing, one of the sort of upshots, in hindsight, one of the analyses that came out was that basically our ability to look at images with computers was pretty much useless in capturing the actual bombers. So in spite of the fact that there are basically cameras everywhere now, every storefront was full of cameras, people were taking pictures of the event and putting them on Flickr, all that data was available, but as the bombing was unfolding, the aftermath of the bombing, it wasn't possible to use computers to watch all that imagery, understand it, and provide actionable inputs. Here's an example of a very high-res photo that somebody took, and if you look carefully, the guy in the white hat over on the left side of the screen is one of the bombers. This is something that computers haven't been able to help us with yet, but we'd like to, because we'd like to be able to respond more quickly. We know humans can do this task, because when these images were released after they had reconstructed that these were the people, but they still hadn't identified them, the friends of the Tsarnaev brothers recognized them in these photos and then proceeded to destroy evidence. So we know humans can do these tasks, but we can't yet deploy computers to do these tasks for us. And the place where computers always win is in scale. So what happened here is basically analysts, humans, sat down and looked at all these images and tried to make sense of them. At the point at which we can recreate those abilities in a machine, then it's just a matter of spinning up more servers and more computers. So there's a huge possibility for both good and bad coming out of these new technologies. So I would argue, given the fact that brains are still so far ahead of computers, there's a huge opportunity here to go back to the brain for inspiration. So it's a little bit like a reverse engineering expedition. If a rival company released a product and you didn't know how it worked, but you wanted to know how it worked, you would buy one and you'd open up the box. In this case, nature has released the product, and we're going to go and we're going to reverse engineer it. And this is this wonderful nexus of computational neuroscience. So here we have a brain, an incredible parallel computer, on the order of 100 billion neurons, each of which is a tiny computer unto itself. Connecting between those order 100 billion neurons are 100 trillion connections between them. Enormous, enormous parallelism. And yet this device, this artifact, this thing in our head, only dissipates about 20 watts of energy. So that's 20 watts of power. So that's comparable to your laptop charger. And yet it can do on the order, depending on how you do your rough back of the envelope calculation, at least petaflops of compute power. So this is an amazing organ, and if we could understand it, we could build things that have never been built before. So I study vision, and I think vision's a great way to illustrate some of what's hard and what's exciting and interesting about machine learning and machine intelligence. So if I show an image to all of you, flash that up, and instantly everyone can recognize what the image is. You may not have been to this place, you may not be able to tell me where it is, but you could probably tell me things like what time of year was it, and which way is the wind blowing, and what would it feel like if you touched the wall of that building. Likewise, if I show you another image, in this case this camel, even if you haven't been to the Gobi Desert and you haven't seen a Bactrian camel, you can instantly recognize what this is. You didn't have to exert any effort. And you could probably even tell me things like what it would sound like to walk on the ground, what it would sound like under your feet as it crunched. And what's so amazing about this is there's this enormous diversity of different objects in the world, but there's a real problem, a real hard problem in interpreting images. So if we have a particular object in the world, in this case, an object I happen to care quite a bit about, this is my daughter. You can see her, presumably you haven't seen my daughter before, but here she is. Her name is Sarisa. But if I show you another picture of her in a completely different view, different lighting, different position, different pose, everyone can still recognize that this is the same person. Now, at a pixel level, those images have almost nothing to do with each other. There's very little in common. There's the histograms of the colors are different, the lighting is different, everything is different about these images. And in fact, we can even recognize these objects when there are high, unusual views and high levels of occlusion. Somehow our visual systems are allowing us to do this. So even though any given object in the world can cast infinitely many different images, we somehow know how to map the correct labels onto the objects we look at. It turns out that the converse is true as well. So I just said that any given object can cast infinitely many different images onto the retina. But it's also true that any given image that comes into your eye can correspond to infinitely many different objects. So if we look at this object here, it looks like some ramps, and anyone have an idea what's going on here? Anyone say magnets? Magnets. So it turns out that this is an optical illusion. And what optical illusions are cases where our visual system breaks down because of this hard, ill-posed nature of the problem of interpreting the sensory world. So it turns out that that's just one accidental view of a scene that looks like a ramp that goes up to the top, but in fact, it's relying on this sort of property that actually in real life, any given image could be infinitely many different things that you're looking at. So somehow your visual system has managed to figure out a way to get around this. Your brain has figured out how to get around these problems. The other problem is that our sensory world is incredibly complex. Now, we generally don't feel like we have to work hard when we walk around and see. We just see and it seems effortless. But if you actually look at the images we have to deal with on a daily basis, they're incredibly busy, incredibly complicated. And in many cases, the information that's necessary for us to solve a task, it doesn't actually even exist in the image. So if we look across the street in this crowded street scene, we're aware that there are people in that scene. But if we zoom in a little bit and then just mask out one of those faces that you were able to see, you can see actually there's no information in the pixels of the image to tell you that that was actually a person. What's happening is your visual system is incorporating all of this contextual information and basically making you hallucinate the impression that you're seeing faces when in fact there's no real information there. So this amazing ability to take this incredibly complicated, incredibly cluttered, incredibly busy world and integrate everything and even build up things that aren't there is really what our brain excels at. And this is what computers aren't yet good at. So what we want to do is go to the brain and ask, how does the brain solve this? And one way to get a very clear picture of how hard this problem is to actually try and teach computers to do problems that brains know how to do. So if we look at this picture of the statue, this is the second most photographed statue in the world, John Harvard. The first one is the Statue of Liberty. And if we actually just zoom in on the face, and then just re-represent as the values, the actual numerical values of the luminance at each pixel, this is basically what a computer has to deal with. So this gives you a little bit of a sense that we have to somehow teach a computer to treat this with the sort of facility that we are able to ingest information from the sensory world. So how does the visual system work? How can we draw inspiration from vision? Well, so an image comes in, photons reach the eye, and then they're transduced into electrical activity by a tissue called the retina, which is on the back of the eyeball, goes through the optic nerve to the brain, which is a massively parallel computer made up of on the order of 100 billion elements. So each neuron is itself basically a tiny little computer that takes in inputs, integrates them, and produces outputs. And then within the brain, there's actually an interesting structure of organization. So if we look at the flow of visual information, it first goes to the back of the brain to an area called V1, and then progressively is transformed again and again in hierarchical fashion throughout the brain. And what we do when we try and build artificial systems that work the same way is to draw inspiration from the architecture and structure of the brain, and then build artificial systems that mimic that structure. And just the same way that the natural brain has neurons, which are tiny little computers, the artificial brain then has mathematical functions that can then progressively transform and understand the image that they're looking at. So there's a problem in that today's computers are much less computationally powerful than the brain. So an easy solution to that today is, instead of dealing with any single computer, basically what we do is we assemble large clusters of computers. So we and others build these huge clusters of arrays of computers to try and tackle this problem. And you may have heard occasionally stories like there's a group at IBM that claimed a few years ago that they had assembled enough computational power to simulate a cat. But it turns out that the computational power, just assembling the computational power, isn't really the problem we have in 2015, or 2016, I should say. It's sort of like saying you have, assemble aluminum and some bolts and you got an airplane. If somebody told me that they had assembled enough aluminum and bolts to build an airplane and they wanted me to get in the airplane, I don't think I would go for it until I at least saw the plane fly. So really, we're in the same boat with this cat. So until we see that we actually have a system that has comparable complexity to a brain that can actually do the things a brain does, that's really the goal. And that's where we need to go back to biology to actually understand the machine and understand how it works. So the sort of third countervailing force, which is really changing the way everything works now, is that we actually, for the first time in a long time, have really powerful tools for interrogating biological systems, to actually go in and reverse engineer that brain. So I'm just going to walk you through a few examples, and then some of our speakers are going to go into deep dives around their own techniques that they've pioneered. So we can wiretap neurons increasingly. So what you see on the left is an image of a sharp metal electrode that's been inserted into the brain, and then the black sort of tree-like structures are individual neurons. And the tip of that electrode is on the order of 20 microns, 20,000ths of a millimeter. And you can actually go and place the electrode close to the cell and listen to the activity of the cell. And this has been a bread and butter technique that we've had for many, many decades in neuroscience, but increasingly now driven by this confluence of different industrial technologies that are taking off, like micro-machining. We can now build these intensely dense arrays. So the middle image is a 17 micron thin silicon machined shank that has tiny iridium electrode pads on it. And now we can shrink huge amounts of electrode contacts into very, very small areas, which lets us record from large numbers of neurons at one time. On the right is an example of technology that one of my students in my lab is working on with carbon fiber electrodes. They're about 5 microns in diameter, so 5,000ths of a millimeter. They're actually hard to see with the naked eye anymore. And what we can do is we can snake tons and tons of these things into the brain and be able to sort of wiretap lots of neurons at the same time to give us clues about how the brain works. In addition, increasingly, molecular technologies are also coming to the party. So a technology called optogenetics that was developed by Carl Deiseroth in Stanford and Ed Boyden here at MIT allows us to basically insert a genetic on-off switch into neurons so that when you shine light on the neuron, it will either fire or stop firing. And again, these tools give us increased experimental access so that if we want to understand how a brain works, we finally start to have the tools to make that happen. And then finally, we also have the ability to use optical and genetic technologies to listen, to actually watch the brain in action. So on the left, I have a picture of a 2-photon microscope, which is in my lab. And in combination with the genetically engineered virus that has a protein that literally lights up when the cell is more active, we can actually watch thoughts happening. So this is sort of raw, unfiltered data. Each one of those little light dots is a neuron in a rat's brain while it's awake, and you're watching this rat have a thought. So it's watching an object, it's perceiving that object, and that's what its brain is doing while this is happening. So we have unprecedented access to the function of neurons for the first time since the dawn of neuroscience. And increasingly, we also have access now to the anatomy. So this is an image from Jeff Lichtman, who will speak later today. This is an electron microscope image. So basically what happens here is you have an electron beam, and you scan it across the tissue, and you can image with very, very small pixels. So these are 4 nanometer pixels. And what you can do then is take these giant many, many slices of these very, very high resolution images and then use those to reconstruct the wiring diagram. And this is a collaboration, this image was produced by a collaboration between Jeff and Hans Peter, who you just met. So increasingly now, we have the ability to interrogate the function, we have the ability to get the wiring diagram, and now all we need to do is just put it together. So this is an especially opportune time as well because the government, both industry and government, are now stepping up to make this happen. I think there's a recognition that the time is right now to drive forward a moonshot expedition to really move the needle on our understanding of the brain. And in particular, Jacob Vogelstein from IARPA, who I'm filling in for at the moment, if he were here, he could have had a chance to tell you about this program that he's just launched, which just started last week. It's called Microns, Machine Intelligence from Cortical Networks. And the goal of this project is to bring together an unprecedented array of scientists, from machine learning experts, data scientists, high-performance computing experts, together with neuroanatomists, neurophysiologists, and computational neuroscientists and modelers, and bring them all together to do a large, focused effort to really figure out once and for all how the brain works. And we've been privileged to be a part of this program. So we're launching our team at Harvard in conjunction with MIT. Andreas Tolias, who's also speaking in the afternoon, is on a rival team. So he'll be able to tell you about what they're up to. And it's an incredibly exciting time to be at this intersection. So with that, we have an amazing group of people assembled. We have John Leonard, who's a roboticist, who's going to tell you about navigation and self-driving cars from the perspective of a computer scientist and a roboticist. We have Francesca Rossi, who's going to tell us about interactions between humans and artificial intelligences. And then in the afternoon session, we're going to hear from some neuroscientists who are on the leading edge of their respective fields. Jeff Lichtman, who is basically pioneering connectomics, this idea that you can trace the wiring diagram of a neural circuit and really understand it. Nancy Kanwisher, an expert on the human brain, because while many of our early efforts have to do with animals, ultimately we want to extend and think about the human as well. And finally, Andreas Tolias, who is a physiologist and very computationally savvy, who is trying to understand the function of cortical networks. So with that, I will close, and if anyone has any questions, I can entertain those. Thank you. Do we have any? Should we just have John come up? Oh. Oh, I think, yeah. Does somebody have a mic? So there are some mic runners who are around. So if you can. Okay.
You commented that the current based on our experience with computers. But isn't there a significant chemical aspect to that, to the workings and the functioning and malfunctioning of the brain?
Absolutely, absolutely. So brains operate over many timescales, and they use lots of different tools to do their job. So the communication between neurons, the firing of neurons, is an electrical phenomenon, but you're right, there are many chemical processes, both within the cell and between cells at synapses, that are critically important. Cells can have memory. They can change themselves. This is how we learn, is we remodel synapses, and that's fundamentally a molecular process that's happening. The great thing is that many of our technologies today, and you'll hear about some of these, also are able to target the chemical inner workings of these cells. So as we move to a point where we can understand the brain at an algorithmic level, we can start to parse apart which parts of the chemistry and molecular life of a cell are important to the sort of algorithm and which ones are sort of just important to the regular housekeeping of the cell. But absolutely, people are thinking about how to model, how to think about those sort of chemical processes in brains.
Thank you.
Yes. We're warming up the mic runners.
So you gave a very nice analogy when you presented the statue of John Harvard and showed us what a machine looks at. And then you went the next hierarchical level, which is we have access to the physiology, meaning on and off switches in the neurons. So that leap that goes from identifying something like a picture, an image, you mentioned that was a great challenge. And I assume the same could be said from the arrangement of the physiological correlates of thoughts and so on. So how do you envision, we see the same problem in vision, but also in the brain, the mechanical aspects and how they translate into thoughts or functionality, right? How do you envision that we will move from this very basic information, which is numbers or on and off switches, right? In the sense that there may be multiple functions that have the same correlates in the brain, as you mentioned with images, right?
Yes.
So just want to what you envision as the pathway or the strategy to sort of go from what I described.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I think one of the things that you'll find in the symposium today is the key to moving forward on all of this is collaboration and multidisciplinarity. So the process of understanding what's going on in the brain requires data science. It requires high-performance computing. It requires computer scientists to help understand and to parse the data, to even know what it means to look at a thought and understand how it maps to the external world. But then meanwhile, you also need the computer scientists to come in and give you a model and give you hypotheses that you can test. And you need physiologists and you need anatomists to give you the data to sort of constrain that. So I think it's these cyclical loops. And my hope is by the end of today, you'll have a much richer sense of the kinds of things, all these different ways where computer science can help neuroscience, and neuroscience can help computer science, and back and forth and around.
So you mentioned that we use technology of the day to think about the brain, so from Descartes to Freud to radios and now computers. Do you think that we're right to stick with computers now, or do you think maybe that the technology, 100 years from now, will be radically different from computers of today, and that will be the more appropriate analogy?
Yeah. So if one of the things that people get tripped up, I think, with when they compare computers and brains, is this idea that you need to make a literal analogy to physical parts of the computer. So one common thing is you think, oh, I wish I could add more memory to my brain, the way I add more RAM to my computer. But it turns out that, as you know, the brain is not organized that way. Actually, memory is distributed and co-local all throughout the brain. So it's a very different architecture. So I think comparing brains to computers, like comparing my brain to this laptop is not the right way to look at things. But what's in common comes from this other use of the word computer, right? So computer science is about computing. It's about algorithms, it's about computing machines, it's about reasoning about systems that are able to perform computation. And that transcends details of the hardware. So you could imagine that we can build neuromorphic hardware that looks like the brain, that tries to copy the structure of the brain, and that might be one way to build machines that are intelligent. But that might not be necessary. Computing gives us a sort of a Rosetta Stone, a key by which we can translate an algorithm on any computing platform to any other computing platform. So today we don't build, the most successful machine learning algorithms don't use neuromorphic hardware that looks like the brain. They use traditional hardware. In fact, they use graphics cards, which is a bit of a strange turn in the last 5 years, in a way they weren't originally intended to be used, to simulate the important parts, what we think the important parts of those algorithms are. So I think the durable thing, even if we're in the future and we have computers that we can't comprehend today, the actual theoretical formal connection between computers and brains is going to be something that's going to be durable for all time, basically. And at some point, we start wondering, what will computers look like? And certainly there is one path where they start looking a lot more like us. And then we start asking questions about how do we live in a world where our computers are comparable to us or work the same way as us, or perhaps we start blurring the lines between us and our devices. We already blur our lines between us and our devices, at least at dinner time, with our devices. But I think we can, as we understand the brain more and more and more, that line's going to get blurrier and blurrier. Yep.
An analogy can be made between organisms and organizations. So in an organism, cells delegate some of the information processing to a central module of the brain and subsidize the brain energetically. But in social organizations like companies or states, individual cells, the people, delegate some of the information processing, but they also subsidize the virtual brain. So the question is, what can we learn from the brains of organizations? And are we trying to learn?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So one of the things that is remarkable about humans in particular, but many other species as well, if you've ever seen an ant colony at work, a lot of simple brains that are coming together and producing amazing emergent behaviors that extend beyond what any single individual can do. I think one of the things that's wonderful about neuroscience and also about computer science, because computer science is savvy to this idea of multiple scales of analysis. I think one of the most interesting things in neuroscience is the sense in which we have hierarchies of organizations of scale where we find the same problems coming up over and over and over again, but being solved in different ways. So the insides of a cell, everything is small enough that molecules can move around on reasonable timescales by diffusion. So there's no need to have bioelectrical signals moving around within a cell. It's close enough that you can just produce a molecule, let it move over there and interact. And if you look at the field of systems biology, which has grown up around the same time as systems neuroscience, you see people talking about networks. You see people talking about sort of the same sorts of dynamics and dynamical networks that we talk about one layer up in neuroscience. And we're just on the edge now where I think we're starting to get to the point where we can start contemplating, making those bridges even higher. And people are. So social psychologists, but also people who work, people who work at Twitter who are trying to understand network dynamics. The very same algorithms, the very same mathematical objects, graphs, are absolutely at work, and the same tools can all sort of vibe off of each other. And fundamentally what's happening is the same underlying problems in nature need to be solved, and the solution comes at a different scale. So thinking more broadly like that, I think that's a very interesting and I think it's a prescient question that in the future we're going to start thinking more and more about how swarms of robots, say, and there are people here at Harvard who work on these kinds of problems, can work together, and how knowing what we know about the brain can help influence how we think about organizations and so on and so forth. So I think that's yet another frontier which is incredibly exciting. Yes, one more question. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm thinking about the brain in a vat concept. Because brains and computers today are great, I guess, analogy, but brains do not exist in vacuum. They're embedded in our bodies. And I think bodies are very important to the brain function. So I just wonder, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, it's certainly the case. I like my body. I like having it. Yeah, no, we exist in a context. This gets a little bit into this question of, we exist in a social context. We exist. Computation is done by parts of our body that aren't our brains. A muscle fiber averages impulses coming in and can integrate. So there's a lot more to computation in the brain and as a full organism than just our brains, though the brain is the thing that's unlocked that complexity that allows us to do very complicated things with our bodies. An interesting thing to ask is, if as we move into an era where Google and Facebook are making amazing strides in artificial intelligences, what will their bodies look like? Do they have a body? Does that make sense? You can't do anything to the world without some sort of a body. But what does that look like? It doesn't have to look like our bodies. So those poor, helpless, falling robots, which are so adorable, and I feel so bad for them as they fall, they're mimicking our bipedal physiology, but they don't have to. You don't have to have eyes that see visible light. The Google car has a laser scanner, which is effectively an eye. One of the things that's interesting about thinking about computing and neuroscience going forward is we aren't constrained by evolution anymore. This body was evolved on the African savanna to do a very particular set of tasks. One of the ways that artificial intelligences can win without even having to beat us in sort of capacity and compute ability is simply by just having different constraints. I mean, we have a hard time doing simple things like not eating too much. But if you have an artificial intelligence, you can set the rules for how it behaves and what effectors it has and what senses it has. It can be adapted to entirely new environments. You could have an artificial intelligence, a machine intelligence that has MRI scanners for eyes, and it just grew up learning how to read MR images. So we get to a very interesting and weird and potentially wonderful, potentially scary world where we can really change the course of how things have evolved. So with that, I think I'm going to let John take over. Thank you. And John is going to talk about robotics and navigation and self-driving cars. Thank you.